taken into account. Another lesson learned is that planning and implementing a locally based monitoring system is slow. Things won't happen quickly, trees will grow quickly, but the system as such with a locally based component is not a fast process. So we need to be patient as implementers or as promoters of participatory systems in this regard. And another lesson is that generating and maintaining local participation can be challenging. That relates to the previous bullet point. It takes a little bit of time to get people involved and motivated, and the motivation needs to come from within. And the challenge in this last bullet is to keep the motivation ongoing. So that involves appropriate incentives, benefits that accrue to the community. So the project design has, of course, needs to have an important component of local benefits, but the measuring, the monitoring, since restoration is a long-term activity, needs to incorporate or at least be mindful that maintaining motivation is not always guaranteed. So here you have a list of what we call essential elements for a participatory monitoring system or approach to function, or at least to include, to have the building blocks that we think are necessary. It is important to be mindful that a monitoring system involves participation. So when we talk again about participatory monitoring, it's not only local, it's the participation of global, national, and local stakeholders. So that's a challenge. You can go to a country and probably forget about the very global layer, but you need to really think deeply on how to connect the local and the national, and a mechanism to oversee it. Who's going to be responsible to really make sure that the system is functioning? Make the monitoring plans at the beginning. This may sound trivial, but monitoring is the last thing to plan and the first thing to drop from big projects. And that's we're not saying that without any base. I mean, that's part of the review as well. There's still a culture of not necessarily inserting monitoring plans from the outset. Dedicate funds for participatory monitoring, and that's a very rough ballpark figure, roughly 10% of the total budget. Set goals in a collaborative fashion and identify a small number of shared indicators. Shared meaning that can be locally useful as well as nationally useful, and that's a challenge and it needs a lot of tinkering. Pick locally appropriate technologies, not necessarily insert or suggest or imposed Western technology or completely scientific technologies, but spend time trying to find out if there are local technologies that can be cost effective and that are informative enough for locals to take decisions. Involve women and marginalized groups, and it's been shown that women see the outcomes of restoration or reforestation differently from men, and they benefit differently, so it's important to have gender consideration. Encourage social learning, in other words, hold workshops and discussions on how and why things are working or not working. And do not impose excessive costs locally. And by cost, it's not only financial, but you can also think about the time needed for a local community or a local group to measure any attribute or any indicator that has been agreed upon previously. And this slide, it's corroborates or at least provides support to what I said before, that monitoring is the last thing to insert in a project and the first thing to drop. Even in developed countries, the culture of monitoring is not really well inserted. The first bullet comes from a study done in the US a little bit over a decade ago, and it showed that out of 3,700 river restoration projects in the USA, only 10% carried out monitoring, which is quite a low figure in a country with a lot of financial resources and with a long culture of ecological restoration. Another article that came out in 2013 says that 94% of 300 articles, about 300 articles on ecological restoration, only focused on biophysical outcomes. So there's also a tendency to look only at plant height, survival, and not necessarily on social learning or social indicators. Along the same lines, a large majority of ecological restoration projects that were analyzed in Colombia a few years ago only monitored short-term goals and involve minimal local participation. So the issue of local participation, it's still challenging nowadays. We finalized an assessment last year on Indian Amazonian countries, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and we were looking at restoration of Indian forests, high elevation forests, and we found that across all those countries there was a clear lack of political will to fund monitoring in national restoration plans. And national restoration plans are becoming very abundant worldwide as a response most of the time to bond challenge and IG target commitments. And if these national plans keep coming out, it's important to insert at least some elements of how exactly the monitoring will be carried out. And we found out that most of the time that does not happen, at least in the sample that we analyzed. And as I mentioned before, upscaling means how do you connect local with national and hopefully global aspirations so that the information flows and that the information that is presented at a global level, it's also corresponding to what is really going on the ground. So there are a few challenges. A participatory monitor system can face, constraints in balancing what we want in terms of linking national versus local needs and goals. So one of the causes is governance bottlenecks across scales from the national to the municipal. And for the information to flow, you need to minimize or at least be mindful that the information from the local to the national system, if there is one, may not flow smoothly. So be mindful of that. Learn from the past. Indicators that represent drivers of reforestation or restoration are usually ignored. I mean, what exactly has happened before that has been conducive to a given degree of forest cover based on active or passive restoration. Learn from the past is critical. Consider a participatory monitoring system that integrates both indicators and local drivers of success. The indicators should, to the extent possible, be reflect what generates success based on lessons learned, and you can find out with interviews or participatory workshops about what has worked and what has not. There are key questions that reflect or at least are associated with the design of a participatory monitoring system. Why monitor? What questions need to be answered? And these can be a very important national level question, or can be a very important local level question. But that is very, very essential. What exactly do we want to know and why? How monitoring will inform decision making on the ground, and who needs to be involved? That's another critical question. Who will do the monitoring and who will manage and centralize the data? It's not trivial. Who will be responsible for getting the monitoring done, building the system and paying for it? A donor, national agency, a mix of it, probably private sector involvement, and avoid creating long lists of indicators that only a few can monitor, often due to technical and financial constraints. We tend to generate the list of indicators first without exactly knowing why a given indicator is needed or how it's going to be measured. So that's a practice that it's quite widespread. Um, the indicators are probably the last things the last things to worry about, and the key questions of why we want to know this type of information and how it will benefit us and how we can measure it comes first. The indicator for that comes later.